Welcome to Nerd Out at Spotify, where we bring you behind the curtain of the world's most popular audio streaming subscription service. Machine learning, open source, clouds, tabs versus spaces. We'll talk to Spotify engineers about interesting tech issues, big and small. In this episode, we're going to dive much deeper into open source software and on the incredible impact that it's had on the software industry and on countless people's lives. Spotify's work with Backstage has given us a front row seat to the impact that even one single project can have. But before diving back into Backstage, let's back up a bit and talk about open source. Today, almost every company depends on open source for critical pieces of their business. There are huge positives to this, and decades of great projects, including Linux and things like the Apache web server, to newer projects like Kubernetes. Though there are also lots of issues with this current reality. We've all seen the XKCD showing how all modern digital infrastructure is like a Jenga tower, and the only thing keeping it from toppling over is one project being thanklessly maintained by a random person on the internet. There's also recent incidents like Log4j or the Faker and Colors NPM libraries, where one exploit or the whims of one individual maintainer can cause widespread harm or chaos. For businesses, open source can be so much more than a technical dependency. Today, reputations can be made in open source. Netflix OSS really cemented Netflix as a technology company. Envoy has highlighted Lyft's engineering prowess to the world. And companies like Google have become very good at using open source as an incredibly valuable marketing and hiring tool. Open source and the communities around open source software are an amazing source for making connections, working together on big problems, learning from each other, and just making some new friends. I know that we at Spotify have greatly benefited from this through years of engagement with various open source communities, conferences, and meetups. These communities give us open, unbiased venues to discuss big problems and solve them together, regardless of who pays our salaries. Personally, I'll always be grateful for all the amazing conversations that I've had sitting on the floors and hallways of various conference venues with people that I'd never have met without the open source community, learning from them and frantically taking notes on my laptop. As an active member of the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, I'm always just blown away by how much I learned from the other members and how much everyone genuinely cares about working together to achieve something greater than ourselves. So let's jump back into Backstage. Today, we're going to focus on two amazing coworkers of mine whose careers have been shaped by working on Backstage. They've had some amazing career growth, learned a lot, made many new friends, and have built remarkable reputations in the open source community. We're going to start with Emma Indal. Emma's career took an unexpected turn when the internal work she was doing at Spotify suddenly became part of a big open source project. Working in the open pushed her out of her comfort zone as an engineer and into speaking at major tech conferences and engaging with and leading a community. Emma has rapidly grown into a brilliant leader, and I couldn't be happier to have her on the show with us. Hey, Emma, let's start off by just introducing you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Spotify?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Dave. Thanks for inviting me here. I work in one of our platforms team and specifically with platform developer experience. And my team is mainly responsible for discoverability in Backstage.
Can you talk a little bit about your experience with open source before Backstage?
Yeah, so honestly, I didn't have any experience at all, or at least not that much before open sourcing Backstage, and especially not for companies. And I was thinking it was a little bit scary when we first started to open source. So
let's talk a little bit more about what you and your team work on at Spotify. I think you gave us kind of a quick intro earlier, but let's dig a little bit deeper on what your team actually does.
Yes. So when I joined Spotify, I joined my team, but at that point we were very focused on technical documentation. We own this kind of plugin in Backstage, which is called TechDocs. And this is all about being able to write documentation in Markdown where it gets generated to HTML, and we take that HTML and render it in Backstage so that you have this one place to read documentation in Backstage. But since then, we have expanded our scope in our squad to be more about discoverability. As an engineer, you want to be able to find things as quick as possible. And to be able to do that, you need maybe this one place where you can go and search for something. If you know exactly maybe what it is you're looking for, you can use the search. But then if you're more in a discovery mode where you don't really know what you're looking for, but you know maybe an area, so you know you're looking for a platform, or you know you're looking for a web library, maybe you're more in a discovery mode and you can go to maybe the explore page and see under web libraries what you can find there. So it's all about finding things as quickly as possible in your day-to-day job.
Can you just say a little bit more about tech docs? And I think you did a KubeCon talk about it, and there was a quote in there about docs like code. Can you explain a little bit what that means?
Yeah, so docs like code is the philosophy that we have applied internally and now also open sourced. And it's all about being able to write your documentation close to like your engineering workflow. So at the same time you're writing your code and developing new features, you also want to be able to document these features so that someone else can get to know about it later. So you write your documentation in Markdown and you commit it, and it's like the exact same Git workflow as you commit and push your changes to your code. And then we have 2 steps built in our CI pipeline. So we generate the documentation from Markdown to HTML, and then we publish it to our GCS bucket as HTML, and then we take that and render into Backstage. So it's all about tightly coupling the documentation writing process with the developer workflow.
You said earlier that you didn't have a ton of experience with open source and it made open source feel scary. So I'm really curious, once you were kind of getting going building this, and then you heard there's going to be an open source version of Backstage, and then you heard that the timeline for that got rapidly accelerated, what did you and your team think at that point? What were your kind of expectations in that moment as you knew the core of what you were building on top of was going to be open sourced extremely quickly?
My team didn't plan to open source so quickly either, but when the core parts of Backstage were open source so quickly and the team started to meet with like potential adopters and stuff like that, documentation were mentioned very often. So that's when we realized like, okay, we need to do this quickly. So I think we planned for a quarter, but then we just took away all of our KRs and focused on open sourcing. And it happened very quickly. And I'm kind of happy that it happened very quickly just because I didn't have to think too much about actually open sourcing things and actually writing code in the public. But yeah, now it's a part of my daily job. So it feels good.
So it's not scary anymore?
No, sometimes it is, but it's such an amazing community. So
how different was the experience once it got going from what you or your team expected?
The interest from the community, I think, was something that we didn't expect it to be so big, and the willingness to contribute. People were eager to just pick up issues and PRs and contribute directly. So those were 2 things that were way beyond my expectations. You kind of have this picture of open source being like a place where people are not nice people. I don't know. I had that picture before at least, but then you enter it and you're like, wow, people are so friendly here and people are spending their time to really give you feedback, and it's very high level of kindness in the community, I think.
Can you talk a little bit about the difference between working on these projects in the open with this large community of people from outside of Spotify as compared to working on the features internal to Spotify, working with teams only within the company and people that are your coworkers?
So I've always been a developer that I'm super interested in knowing the user problems and trying to understand customers and users and stuff like that. And internally, you have them so close to you. Like I am my own user really, but it's also so easy to go to one of our users' desk and like asking them a few questions. And that is not really possible in the same way, I would say, in the open, because you're much more far from the users, but also because there are so many more. So that's why we had to take a few decisions to make it more open, extendable to other users' needs. Since I do work still both internally and in the open, one thing that is difficult is to balance the needs. Like if someone opens an issue and requesting a new feature for Tech Talks or search or whatever, versus someone internally at Spotify asks for a feature or something, should we prioritize internal needs or should we prioritize open source needs? But this is going to become way more easier now because we've just released an experiment internally where we have brought Tech Docs open source internally. So finally, we're going to have one code base and being our own adopter. And that's awesome. So my whole team are looking forward to this so much. And we're so excited about this.
Yeah, that sounds like a great milestone.
Yeah.
Pulse, I'm also curious about the relationship you see between Spotify and open source Backstage. Why is it even valuable for Spotify to have Backstage be open source?
The big thing that I see is that we are able to move even faster than we've been able to do before. So we have been able to have teams who are owning their own plugin and they have been able to contribute to Backstage quickly and stuff like that. But now when we have open source Backstage, it's the entire world who can contribute. And as long as we are clear in our roadmap and our way forward so that people can actually pick up like issues and contribute, it's way quicker for us to get to where we want. My team working on search, for example, we're just 4 engineers. If it's only us, it's going to take way longer time.
Were you surprised to see that a company like Spotify was investing this heavily into open sourcing a project like Backstage?
I was a bit surprised because it's a bit outside of our mission, really. Yes, we can speed up our engineers internally by having Backstage, but it's not around like music or audio or something like that. But it makes us faster to get there.
Now that one of the big new features was search for open source Backstage. I'm curious what was different about search in open source Backstage as compared to search in internal Backstage.
Yeah, it's so much. No, but so we open source Tech Docs first, and then we realized that people were very eager in being able to search for information in Backstage. So quickly after we decided to open source search, but we kind of wanted to think about, okay, so what have we learned with the search we have internally in terms of, for example, so many teams is coming to us and more now to wanting to get their content indexed to search. And we're like, scratching our heads all the time because it's not a clear path to get there. And so that was one thing that we've learned internally, that we need to improve the developer experience of getting things indexed to search. And another thing was that, okay, so if we open source search, yes, we're using Elasticsearch internally, but just because we are using Elasticsearch, it doesn't mean that other adopters is using Elasticsearch. So we quickly realized that we need to have this integration layer where you can integrate with whatever search engine supported, of course, that you want, but also be able to contribute new layers of search engines. And on the other side of that, we wanted to kind of continue to have this distributed ownership, because it makes sense. If you own a plugin, you are the expert of what gets indexed to search for this plugin. So you should also own the functionality that gets the thing that you want to index and make that available for the search engine or the search plugin in our case to index that. So now we have more of a search platform where plugin owners can build upon, and that we are also bringing internally in just a few weeks, which is so exciting.
Did you find people outside of Spotify actually adding support for other search engines and search providers on top of the platform that you built?
Yeah, and it happened so quickly. So our goal was to provide a very basic in-memory search engine as a first one so that people could adopt the search plugin very quickly and get search. And we open sourced that, I think, just before summer in Sweden, so around May or something. And then we had a community session where we demoed it and wrote a blog post around it in June. And then when I came back from vacation in end of July, 2 search engines were already contributed. So it happened so quickly, and it was so cool to see. And I've actually not even been able to dive deeper into, it was Elasticsearch and Postgres that were contributed because it happened so quickly. And so I'm really excited to do that now when we're bringing something which is totally contributed from the community and not built by us.
Do you think that without open source, internally Spotify would have ever kind of taken Backstage search to this place?
Maybe at some point, but we were able to get so much good feedback from the community. So the way we did it was we created an initial roadmap and an initial search architecture, and then we asked for feedback from the community. So we did get some good feedback from the community so that we could make it even better. Like the benefits are more than that. Let's say that Spotify decide to change from Elasticsearch at one point. That's going to be much of an easier migration for us because another option is going to be already supported. What we did see internally was that plugin owners in Backstage started to create their own search experiences. So people developed a search bar here and the search page there, and it was so different from page to page. And the experience across Backstage got very fragmented in a way. So that was another thing we wanted to focus on when we open source search, with a better collection of front-end components that you could use across both plugin pages, but also recently we merged a contribution from Expedia where they contributed a search modal, so you can have this kind of quick search across Backstage. And those are all built on this collection of search components that we have made available for anyone. So that's something that we are hoping to see internally as well, that we can have a collection of search components that is used across Backstage and not having different experiences from plugin to plugin.
I'm curious, kind of from the community side, how different was the feedback and the interaction with the community from what you initially expected?
No, I don't think I had much expectations. We were asking for feedback, but we didn't have expectations on actually receiving anything. So that's, I guess, the biggest surprise, that we received way more than we were thinking, at least from my perspective. And that made me realize that we should do this more. If we get this amount of feedback when we're not expecting anything, we should just do this more and more. So I think that is something definitely we can improve on, and opening up more issues that people can contribute to, be more clear in our descriptions of issues and stuff like that, like labeling issues better and having clearer and better roadmaps so that people in the community know where we are heading, because then it makes it easier for them to contribute to that journey too.
What do you think is the biggest contribution we've seen from outside of Spotify?
Ooh.
And it can just be your favorite. It doesn't need to be some analytic way of defining biggest.
Yeah, so I'm so into search and tech docs, and there are great contributions, but looking at how quickly it happened, I must say the search engines for search, because that was kind of, me coming back from vacation. I was like, what, already? That's crazy. I was looking at our roadmap today, and we had defined search beta and search GA, things that already have been contributed by the community. And that's so cool. I think just because I'm so focused on tech docs and search, it must be that.
That's fine. I'm happy to accept a very biased answer.
Yeah.
Are there other things that come to mind as obvious ways Backstage as a product has improved through being open source?
I mean, there are people coming in with so many great ideas all the time. And so one thing that comes to mind is having the same user experience across Backstage, because this is something that we have seen internally and something that becomes more and more of a problem, that we haven't had this collection of components internally that people can pick and use from. And we haven't had guidelines of how things should be used or how things should be styled. And I think that's such an important thing to have when something becomes as large as Backstage, because you have this autonomy where people starting to develop their own things. And if you do not have any guidelines and reusable components and stuff like that for that, people will go on and make their own decisions. That would be one thing that I think have improved by open sourcing Backstage, because the need for it became bigger. So now we realize that this is great to have internally too.
What's been the biggest surprise for you in working in the open? It can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing.
Back to what I mentioned a little bit before, the biggest surprise is the big community. It's so many people. I mean, Backstage is a great product, but I didn't expect so many people being interested in it and adopting it so quickly and contributing to it. And even companies hiring for Backstage engineers, that is crazy. So that's probably the biggest surprise, seeing if you browse on LinkedIn and you see a company hiring for a Backstage engineer. That's I never expected that to happen during my career.
That's quite a milestone for a project, I think. Now, we'll talk to Himanshu Mishra. Unlike Emma, Himanshu was drawn to open source early on. He discovered this amazing world in college and developed such a strong passion for it that much of his career has been defined by it. He's found ways to get himself deeper and deeper in every year, and now it's his job.
My name is Himanshu Mishra. I'm based in Sweden. I joined Spotify in August last year, so about 1.5 years. I am a full stack engineer here, and I work on the Backstage team at Spotify. So Backstage is our open source project. It's donated to CNCF. It's doing really good out there in the open source community. So I love working on Backstage engineering wise, but also the whole open source gig of it.
So tell me a little bit more about college and kind of how you got here, and maybe a little bit of why you view this as a dream you had.
The Indian student scenario is super competitive. So if I want to study computer science, I have to be like the top 1% of the 1% to get into a good college and get computer science. I got into a good college, fortunately, but I didn't get the computer science. I was like, but should I let this decide what do I do in future? So instead of actually relying on coursework, I was like, what is this open source thing? I should try it out. And I just started contributing to a whole bunch of projects, started learning about communities and what is happening in this open source world, read about the 90s open source folks and what they inspired to and like what the world they imagined. I formed a club to inspire students to use open source as a way to take control over your career, basically. You don't have to rely on college and have to rely on professors and your curriculum to decide what you want to learn. If you want to learn front-end stuff, just see what front-end projects are out there and start contributing. I landed a job in Tokyo. It was a good job, but I was working on private stuff. I still wanted to learn more about open source economics per se. There's no word open source economics, but I'm interested in why do people do this? What's the reason behind, working for free or just doing stuff for learning? And then a person whom I worked with before in my internship joined Spotify and then told me about, hey, Backstage got released this month and you should try it out. And I'm one of those persons whose weekend hobby is to contribute to open source projects. So during my job, when I was in Tokyo, I contributed few pull requests to Backstage and all of them got merged on the same day. Thanks to the maintainers, thanks to the product manager. I was super impressed. I was engaged. I was on Discord. I didn't want to go to sleep. I wanted to keep talking to these people because I kind of realized the momentum of the project. And 6 months later, which I wanted to be next week after contributing, but it took 6 months for me to come here in Sweden.
I want to go back to the earlier part where you were talking about the club and some of the advocacy in India. Can you talk a little bit more about what that club was and your motivations for creating it and the impact that it had?
So the Indian education system is a bit segregated. Since Indian population is so huge, you can't allow millions of students to decide on one course and basically you'll struggle for professors and resources. So I felt that bit of a silo between what people actually want to do versus what the system can support. That segregation of we are assigned computer science and so we are the ones who can talk to computer science, and there was a club, there's always a club in college which was only for computer science students. And I was like, no, we can't have department specific clubs, and there has to be something which is more open per se and more focused towards not teaching ourselves, not teaching 10 people who are in the club, but rather than targeting the entire community that's 10,000 students on campus. So the club was mostly trying to solve the big problems of what to do when I have git merge conflict. Then we turned on to some basic programming languages. In our college, C was the major programming language which was taught, but most of the open source projects were in JavaScript and in Python, and no one was teaching these things. And people were kind of hitting things in the dark, exploring things on their own. So we were like, no, there are good curriculum out there. We just need some hands-on working with students to help them out. So this was my first and second year. In my third year, I was like, but people aren't really getting what open source is. They were like, why are we doing this? And I had a list of reasons why should college students do open source. And it just kept on growing past 10, 15. I was like, I have 15 things and why aren't people getting it? So I thought of, let's do a bigger thing. Let's do a conference. So we did a open source conference. It was the best time of my life. I remember community organization wise. And there were tracks on tutorials, there were tracks on unconference rooms, on impact of open source on students' careers, hiring patterns changing in the industry. Like now people are looking into, have you done a Google Summer of Code? How many open source projects are you doing? So we talked about these things and actually like, what should we do and what's good for the community?
I find it very impressive when you can just casually say, oh, we put together a conference, like it was nothing. One thing you talked about was a job you had doing non-open source things, and you were constantly interested in open source economics. And what you were saying is like, why do people do these things for free? Do you feel like you have an answer to that question now?
I see different personas in this community and everyone has different reasons. So for example, even in Backstage community, students have the sole reason of learning. And if I get to understand how this project works and if I get to make tweaks, I'm actually like upskilling myself. So they stay up late at nights just to make sure they land in a contribution. And that also helps their self-esteem. Engineers from other companies trying to contribute to open source. Sometimes people are bored of working on just one thing and like with same set of people. So they're kind of looking for new types of people and new types of projects and new technologies, and that they try to contribute on their own, even if their company is not using it. These are the three personas that I see. And then other things is if you want to join that company, then yeah, go ahead, make contributions, build your resume, understand who are the people you'll be working with. So for me, when I interviewed for Spotify, I kind of knew everyone in the interview panel, like except for a few people. And in one of the interviews, we forgot to do introductions because we were just chatting in the morning on Discord. So like by contributing and working with those people, you're actually like understanding how they behave and how they talk. And you build up that confidence of, okay, I kind of know what this team looks like and it sounds exciting. It's a great hiring tool. It's a great marketing for hiring as well.
Can you elaborate on what you meant by like working in open source really let you take control of your career?
This might be too deep, but why are we software engineers? Like everyone has personal reasons for doing the work they do. It could be a combination of multiple things. It could be doing great work. It could be building a better society. It could be money. It could be like just in having fun. So I feel like when I'm solving those array manipulation and inverting a binary tree, I don't get that. I get that, okay, why am I solving this problem? It's for getting a good job, cracking that interview. So for me, that's kind of has less inspiration and adds lesser meaning in my life. But when I'm actually like creating a small project where I can watch a random TV series or get a recommendation, building a CLI, which I use to set personal reminders, like these things, I feel like I'm actually improving my life by doing programming and gives me more meaning for some reason. So when I'm doing these smaller open source projects or actually contributing to them, using them, my passion increases, my meaning of doing work improves. When I'm doing competitive programming, which I know I'm not going to use in my real world job, I'm not doing it. Doing open source adds more meaning, gives me more validation that what I'm doing is actually what I want to do, spend most of my time on.
You talked about the three categories of people contributing, and it seems like your story had you moving almost through those three as stages rather than like different people. I'm curious both how you look at that and how you feel like that progression really helped you.
Yeah, you're right. That is a stage. Like I no longer feel like I'm a student and I should contribute to learn. The other side of open source, what does it feel like to work on an open source project while being in a company which pays you to do that stuff? To be honest, I'm having a hard time trying to like realize this reality. I'm definitely in the very early stages of this third phase where you are in the industry, where you're part of a corporate who is doing open source. We should come up with a sustainable model for open source. Not everyone should be working for free. You should get something out of it, whether you use that project in your company. Like multiple companies are working together to build something which they can reuse inside the company. Something like that makes sense. This is not something which I had imagined 5 years ago. I was like, yeah, everything for free. Do it on your weekend. Now I'm like, no, maybe there needs to be a better structure.
So it sounds like that question you asked early on keeps getting more and more complicated. You said that when you came to interview at Spotify, you felt like you already knew everyone on the team, and with some people you didn't even really need to do introductions. Can you talk a little bit about how that came to be before you even interviewed?
So as I said, when I was in Tokyo over the weekends, I tried making contributions to Backstage, and all of my PRs got merged on the same day. And Backstage has this Discord group. And Discord, as you know, is quite informal. The stage was really set for interacting with the community in a very personal level. I can talk about some features, I can talk about plans, I can talk about like non-code stuff. And it was happening. Like the product manager at that time, and we were talking about Pants. This is the Twitter's build tool. And we were thinking, can you build a plugin for it? Like I was not an employee and he was already giving me tickets to work on. But I really appreciated all of these conversations because I wanted to be a part of the community. And I heard good things about Backstage at Spotify. And I knew it's been here for a long time. I knew if it's open source, it's going to be really popular. And it had like around 500 GitHub stars when I saw it. But it now has 5-digit GitHub stars. For a student like me, that's huge. Now I don't look at GitHub stars, but when I was a student, that's all I looked at when I saw new projects, because that's how I knew are people interested in this.
You've had a bunch of experience with open source before you jumped into Backstage, and you talked about your PRs getting merged, but I feel like there had to have been more than that as a start that made Backstage stand out as a community you wanted to be a more active part in and working for Spotify as opposed to any other open source project where you could have been a part of the community and interviewed for working there. What was it about Backstage and Spotify?
Yeah, indeed. Spotify is definitely attractive as a company. Like I've been using this since college. So it's definitely a dream place in my top 10 places to work at. Also, Daniel is a hacker. Like he used to be a hacker. And when I see a CEO who has been doing tech in their early ages, I'm actually like attracted to that company where I can see that up in the chain of my management, everyone kind of understands tech and lives tech. And so tech won't be compromised per se. If the CEO doesn't have much of tech experience, they see tech as a resource or, not so deep into like, what's the life of an engineer?
Yep. So do you feel like you can really tell a lot about a company by looking at their open source?
Yeah, it's hard. Like I used to judge companies beforehand for not doing open source. I don't do that anymore. I understand their reasons and priorities and whatnot. So I can talk about one factor here. A lot of the companies have this problem of not invented here syndrome, and they want to use things that they have created for some reason. Like in my previous company, not to explore too much, but there were 5 things where there were huge popular open source projects out there, but they created those things from scratch and all the original people left. And I, as an engineer, was struggling with the documentation and how to use this. And we would have either open source that new project because you feel like it's an important part of your project. So open source it, talk to the community. Why be limited with these like 20 people inside your company or 200 people inside your company? The world is full of engineers trying to solve similar problems. So if you can convince bigger audiences, it's probably a good thing and it will stay even if your employees leave. So if a company is doing open source and like actually talking to the community, not doing open source, but actually going to conferences and talking to people, even if you're a small company now, are you thinking about these things?
I'm curious what you felt like you learned about Spotify from your work in open source with Spotify. Did you feel like your answers of what it's like to be there were answered through that?
Yeah. When I joined, the Backstage team at Spotify was around 5 to 10 engineers back then, and now it's 40 something. It's grown heavily. Spotify keeps on investing so much in open source. And I think that's the sign that I saw was all those people, early maintainers, product managers, like they were actually talking to community, hosting public events, getting feedback, building things. They really wanted to build something in the community. And I think Spotify just keeps on multiplying that investment. Donating the project to CNCF is another strong sign that we want to build this not just for Spotify, but for the world. Don't want to sound too big, but yeah, we want to build Backstage for all the big companies who are facing similar challenges as Spotify. Openness, collaboration. When you work in open source, you can't work in silos. Like you have to get your PR reviewed by people. Your code is being seen by other people. You have to put in comments. You have to write really neat code. And I saw that from outside, and internally, like, yeah, that's how people work. Like, I can talk to maintainers about any code that I want to. I think it's quite collaborative place. That's how I saw from externally, and now I'm feeling it inside.
Now that you're inside, what's your role in that community and in maintaining the field that you just described?
My role is, for now, just to continue building the product. Like, Backstage is soon to be 1.0, and all the features need to be moved to GA. So that's the current milestone. I can say there are few habits, few signs that can be seen because I was out there, that when I'm writing an issue, a GitHub issue, I put in like 20 minutes to write that, even if it could just be just 2 lines. I make sure to link to the relevant files. I make sure to question myself, does this have enough context? I assume that this is going to be taken in like 1 hour after me creating a GitHub issue. And I'm actually talking to this strange anonymous person over the internet when I'm writing a GitHub issue. It doesn't happen when I create my Jira tickets internally. So yeah, whenever I'm creating public issues, I'm very hyper aware of like who's reading it and what are they getting out from this. I used to tweet about, if I created 10 good first issues, I would just tweet about it. And then I did a pairing session over the weekend with someone, some random person on the internet. You don't have to like know the person and understand their background to actually work on a problem. Because when I was a student, I was working with strange people. Strange people is a bad phrase. I was working with anonymous people, people whom I didn't know. So I'm trying to be that person now. I'm trying to be a safe person whom you can express, even if you don't know me. Ping me on Discord, ping me on Twitter, and let's hack on this together. I'll make sure your introduction to this project is neat and easier, and then you can actually figure out like how do you want to help out? Do you want to build a new plugin? Do you want to add to core features and whatnot?
So it sounds like a big part of your role now is identifying people like who you were at one of those earlier stages and helping them out.
Yeah, indeed. Even in my current team, like we have new engineers joining. I mean, I'm still very early in my career, and I understand what it feels like to go in a place where you have zero context, but there's like too many things going on already. And every term is like, what is this plugin? What does this do? Like, you always have these questions in mind. So actually, I err on the side of over-explaining in my current team. Too much explanation. Like every topic has to be like rediscussed. Like, why are we doing this work, and what's the importance of this plugin? Why was this created? So yeah, turning into a onboarding helper more than the rest of my job.
Let's talk a little bit about the future of the Backstage community. What are you most excited about that you haven't done yet?
A Backstage conference. That's what I'm looking at. It's my dream. The numbers are really positive. In terms of pull requests and GitHub issues, we get 150 every week. It's too many things for people to manage, 4 maintainers that we have. And in Discord, we have around 4,000 to 5,000 people. I don't exactly remember the number, but there's always 300 people online. So if you post something on Discord, there's someone who can help you out. Initially, it was only the maintainers trying to answer questions. Now the community is helping itself, which is a healthy sign for any project. I can see like companies trying to work more closely with the existing companies who are working on Backstage. So Spotify has, all of the maintainers are from Spotify, but soon as you move up the CNCF ladder, we'll add more maintainers from different companies, and that's going to solidify collaboration across companies. I think the world, I don't know. When I say the world, I'm only saying the companies that I've looked at, but developer portal was a new thing when I learned about Backstage, and I didn't even know, okay, yeah, this is something you can actually create inside your company and solve like these 3 problems: create, manage, explore, and also onboarding problems. This is a solution to a problem which companies didn't realize. And I feel like that's an interesting thing that I will see in future, is people will realize, okay, developer portals and a platform, and what are the possibilities of things that we can build on top of Backstage?
I'm curious to hear a little bit more about the community itself. Who are the people that are very active in Backstage? How do you kind of nurture that community? What's going on now?
I feel like people who are adopting Backstage, people who have actually done proof of concepts and building on top of Backstage, evangelizing their internal community inside the company, they are working quite closely with us. So they hang out on Discord a lot. Over Discord, we don't just get technical questions, we also get like philosophical questions. So hey, why don't we have a conference integration in Backstage? We want to write code in conference. And then we'll be like, maybe you should look into docs-like code. And this is how it worked for Spotify. And then those people will share stories from their companies. And this is how we are doing it in our company. So Backstage Discord is becoming world's platform developer experience Slack channel. Yeah, so that's how I see more people from different companies interested in developer experience. I also go into that phase of learning at times. So when I'm talking to the community, I don't just say things as they are. I leave a door open for, hey, tell me if this is something that you think can be done in a better way and I can execute.
What does developer experience mean to you?
So as an engineer, if I have to create something in my company, sometimes I have to talk to too many people, actually find out what's the reason of having this service and this metrics from there and reporting from there and deployment from there and how you do further deployments and what's the documentation. Too many things that I have to know before I actually create something new. So it actually kind of hampers my experience. It actually slows me down. So I feel like if a company is really prioritizing developer experience, it will try to identify the problems of creating new things in your company and make sure it's super easy that you don't have to learn these 10 things that you'll be using eventually. But if you're making a website, why do you have to learn about Kubernetes? What's the reason behind it? So for me, it's, you want to create something, you want to create a new feature in your app, you want to create a website and a backend service. You should focus most of your time in that rather than the other parts of it. So for me, Backstage comes into play where you can create stuff and get things taken care of by other people, other smart people, and you focus on your writing your JavaScript.
Do you have any advice for people who are at that earlier stage? How do you get to the point where you are now?
Create a GitHub profile picture. No, that's not a good advice. But I do feel like the personal connections have helped me a lot. So talk to people. I feel like if I had sit in my room quiet and had not talked to anyone and just written code, I might not be here. I might not have landed those internships and knew those people from the community and went into those conferences and given those talks. I feel like every conversation has helped me along the journey. And I would really err on the side of talking too much to people. You don't have to be an extrovert to do this because it's a job. Treat this as part of doing this, that you share how you feel about code and programming and engineering overall. So my friends who were also doing this in the beginning, they were also interested in open source, they were quite silent at times. And I feel like the reason was that they had no one to talk to and no one understood where exactly are they stuck. It could be just their frustrations with C, for example. There has to be someone who can tell you that C is not the only programming language, and just because of C, you don't have to quit whole programming. Just try out a different language. What's your advice, Dave? I want to hear. What's your advice to your younger self?
Honestly, I think the thing that I most often say is the same thing you just did, is talking to people. So I'd have to think of something else, and maybe that something else would be to not be afraid of the things you have to say. I mean, one thing that you just recently said was that you talk to these people and you started mentioning titles like staff engineer, and then you get nervous that you're saying the wrong thing. And that's the second half of talk to people, is don't be afraid of the thing you have to say, because it doesn't matter what the person's title is. They're asking you the question, just answer it and have the conversation, and maybe they'll have a better idea, or maybe they'll have a fancier title than you and you'll have a better idea. Just have the conversation and don't worry about who you're having it with. What else do you nerd out about these days?
I'm very interested in getting more, especially girls, but kids in general, into programming. So I'm doing a little bit of volunteering with the startup called Imagilabs. They are developing an app and little device to make programming more creative and tangible, because we need more engineers for the future, because the future is going to be even more digital.
When I was in college, I was huge into poetry. And after that, I kind of left it. I got into this real world and all I did was programming and think about career. So now I'm trying to tell myself, don't let the artist in you die. I'm trying to make music. So I've been learning guitar for now 4 years. When I'm doing it, I really feel good. I feel healed spiritually.
Thanks for listening to Nerd Out at Spotify and coming with me on this journey through 2 exciting careers at Spotify in open source. Personally, I find both of these stories inspirational, and they push me to want to do more in various communities that I'm a part of. I hope that this episode pushes you to do the same, and that I'll see you in some conversations online, at a conference or a meetup, or just starting to push code out in the open. If you need a little extra nudge or aren't sure where to start, check out the open source page on the Spotify engineering blog, or look in the show notes for links to some of our open source projects. Nerd Out at Spotify is produced by Spotify's Ted Vergakis and Seaplane Armada, who also wrote our fantastic theme song. Special thanks to our guests this episode, Emma Indall and Himanshu Mishra. I'm Dave Zolotuski. Thanks for nerding out with us.